This is my true story. I built everything my son now stands on. Every brick, every number in the bank, every ounce of the family name's reputation. I handed it to him without asking for anything in return. But the last time we spoke, in front of board members, investors, and my own blood, he looked me in the eye and said, "You ruin everything you touch." I didn't reply. I didn't flinch. I simply went silent. That silence was my final gift. Because while he laughed over drinks that night, mocking the man who made him, I called my lawyer. And what I did next left him with nothing. Before I tell you, comment where you're watching from and what time it is, and subscribe, so stories like mine don't disappear in silence. I built the family business from nothing, not from a loan, not from inheritance, from the ground up, with sleepless nights and hands that never stopped working. I remember signing deals in the back of my truck, negotiating contracts over a rotary phone, and eating cold dinners at midnight just to finish paperwork for clients who didn't care if I dropped dead the next day. I never went to college, but I made sure my son did. He never once had to apply for a scholarship. I paid for every semester in full, every book, every off-campus apartment, every internship that didn't pay him a dime. I made sure he had a car before I ever owned a new one myself. I wore the same pair of shoes for 5 years, while he wore polished leather to his first job interview. And when he graduated, I didn't ask him what he wanted to do. I already had the answer waiting, a seat at my table. I brought him into the company without hesitation, introduced him to my suppliers, my staff, my board members. I handed him a reputation I spent 35 years building. I thought I was handing him a future, but all I was really doing was putting the knife in his hand. I taught him how to read the books, how to make margin work, how to negotiate without losing your soul. I walked him through every part of the company, from inventory to forecasting. I didn't just give him a job, I gave him a legacy, my name, my network, my everything. And I never asked for anything in return. Not praise, not thanks, not even loyalty, just care. That he'd take what I gave him and carry it forward with respect. But looking back now, I realize I didn't raise a successor. I raised someone who thought my sacrifice was just a stepping stone. Someone who saw what I built and thought, I can do it better. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that he wanted to grow beyond me, but that he never once looked back to say, "You built this." I remember one night, a few years after he joined, I was going through a stack of invoices and noticed his signature on one of our vendor renegotiations. He'd slashed the price so aggressively that the supplier nearly pulled out. When I asked him about it, he said, "Dad, this is how the new generation runs things. No respect for the relationships. No care for the people who kept us alive when we were nothing. Just ego, aggression, the illusion of efficiency." And I still stood by him, defended him, told the board he just needed time, that he was ambitious, not reckless. I told myself all fathers go through this, that tension between what you built and what your child wants to tear down and remake in their image. But I never expected him to tear me down too, and not just in private, in front of everyone, because all those years of building him up, they didn't build gratitude, they built entitlement. I still remember the day he got his first big media feature, a business article that named him the visionary young COO taking his father's company into the future. Not one mention of me, not one word about how he got there. I clipped the article and folded it into my wallet anyway. Because even then, I wanted to believe he'd come around, that one day he'd realize what was handed to him, that he'd see the foundation under his feet and remember who laid every brick. But that day never came. And I'd already given him everything, the knowledge, the trust, the keys to the kingdom, everything except the one thing he thought he already had, control. Because behind every signature, every board vote, every financial account, there was still one name that mattered, mine. The shift didn't come like an earthquake. It came like a slow leak. A little disrespect here, a little arrogance there. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that he was just finding his voice, that maybe I needed to let go of the reins more often. But the more I stepped back, the more he stepped on me. It started in meetings. He'd cut me off mid-sentence, offer a fresher perspective, refer to my approach as outdated, said things like, "We can't scale with a 1990s playbook, Dad." The staff would laugh, uncomfortably, unsure who to side with. I laughed too, the first few times. Let it slide. Let him feel clever. But it didn't stop there. He started holding meetings without me, making decisions without my input, canceling contracts with vendors I'd worked with for decades. And when I confronted him, he shrugged, said, "It's business, not personal." But everything I ever built was personal. That business was my life. Every deal I made carried my name, not just my logo. I'd shake hands with suppliers like they were family. Now, they were just rows in a spreadsheet to him. I watched my son turn from student to saboteur, slowly, smoothly, like he'd been planning it. I'd walk past his office and hear him on the phone saying things like, "We're modernizing the company now that I've taken over." Taken over? There was no takeover. I still owned 70% of the voting power, still signed every tax return, still controlled the trust that funneled the operating cash into this empire. But to him, my ownership meant nothing if he could undermine me in public. I remember walking into a client meeting once, and he said to them, without blinking, "Don't worry, my dad won't interfere." Like I was the liability, the dead weight, the obstacle in his narrative of success. It wasn't long before the staff followed his lead. They started addressing him first. Emails that used to go to both of us quietly shifted to just him. People started calling me Mr. Thomas Sr. again, like I was just the guy who founded the company, not the man still keeping it alive behind the scenes. But I kept showing up, kept working, kept pretending like I didn't notice, because I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd come to his senses. I took him to lunch one afternoon, tried to have a heart-to-heart, told him, "This company's your future, but don't forget who gave you the past." He barely looked up from his phone, said, Yeah, I appreciate everything you did, but things have changed. No, thank you. No, you built this." Just that blank millennial tone I've come to hate. Detached, superior, entitled. And still, I let it go. Because I was his father. And fathers are supposed to forgive, right? We absorb the blows. We stay standing. But looking back now, all I was doing was training him to hit harder. I started watching how he talked about me to others. He'd call me old school with a smirk. Say things like, "My dad means well, but he doesn't get it." I started becoming the punchline in rooms I built. One time, during an investor call, he muted me. I found out afterward when the assistant told me my mic had been off the whole time. When I confronted him, he said, "You were going off topic." I stayed silent, because if I spoke, I'd say things I couldn't take back, and I still wanted to believe this was just a phase. But the truth was simple. I had raised a son who no longer saw me as a mentor. He saw me as a mistake he had to fix. And the worst part? I gave him the tools to do it. Every password, every connection, every inch of access. I opened every door, and he slammed them in my face, one by one. I started feeling like a ghost inside my own legacy. And what haunted me most was how proud I used to be of him. I've been disrespected before, by competitors, banks, clients who thought I was too poor to be taken seriously. But nothing ever cut as deep as what my own son did to me that day. You expect enemies to mock you. You never expect it from your blood. It was a quarterly board meeting. Our senior managers were present. So were outside investors. These were the men and women who'd seen me build the company from a folding table to a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I had sat at the head of that conference table for over 30 years. And that morning, I walked in and found my chair already occupied by him. No heads turned. No one flinched. It had already become normal. I didn't say a word. I sat down in a different chair, one that used to belong to guests. That's how it started. The agenda moved fast. He led the presentation. He made the slides. He used language like our new direction, my restructuring plan, and the company's next era. My name was never mentioned once. I nodded along. I smiled where appropriate. I held my tongue, even when I saw projections that made no long-term sense. When it came time for open discussion, I raised my hand like a schoolboy. That's how far I'd fallen in the room I built. I asked a question, calmly, clearly, something about the long-term burn rate on one of his new R&D initiatives. A question anyone on that table would have asked had they not been afraid of upsetting the new king. He didn't even let me finish. He looked me dead in the eye, tilted his head slightly and said, "You know, you ruin everything you touch." Silence. Heavy. Cold. Every face at that table froze, not in disagreement, not in protest, but in disbelief that he had finally said out loud what everyone suspected he felt. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I just looked back at him, calmly, and nodded once. And that somehow made the room even colder. No one stood up for me. Not one voice said, "That's your father." Not one person reminded him that every chair they sat in was paid for by my sacrifice. They all just looked away, awkward, embarrassed, silent. And in that silence, I understood something deep. I was already gone to them. I was no longer the founder, no longer the builder, no longer the one they feared or admired. I was just the old man they tolerated. He moved on like it never happened, like he hadn't just buried me alive in front of my own staff. Finished the slide, clicked through the next proposal, made jokes, got chuckles. I watched him command that room like he owned it. And maybe, in that moment, he did. After the meeting, people avoided eye contact. The managers didn't say goodbye. The assistants didn't offer coffee. I walked out of that boardroom with my back straight, but inside, I was gutted. That wasn't just a betrayal. It was a public execution. When I got home that night, no one asked how the meeting went. His wife didn't look up from her tablet. I heard them laughing behind the door later, maybe watching a movie, maybe celebrating. I sat at the kitchen table alone, replaying his words. "You ruin everything you touch." All I could think was, if that's how he really felt, why hadn't he walked away? Why stay in my house? Why live off the empire I built? Why eat the fruit of a tree you claim is rotten? That's when it hit me. He didn't want to leave me behind. He wanted to replace me, cleanly, publicly, and permanently. And he had just taken the first step, humiliation. But what he forgot is that while he might have taken the spotlight, I still held the foundation. I said nothing that night, nothing the next day either. I let them laugh. I let them forget I was even in the house. But inside, something had shifted. Not anger, not revenge. Something colder, something older. A kind of silence that comes before the storm. Because now, it was my turn. After that boardroom meeting, something inside the house shifted. It wasn't loud, no yelling, no fights. Just a silence that started creeping in under the doors and into the walls, like fog rolling in over a forgotten field. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels deliberate, calculated. Like everyone around me had agreed I was no longer part of the picture, but no one had the guts to say it out loud. Not even him. Meals became quieter. At first they still set a plate for me. The wife, the staff. I'd come to the table and find food waiting. No words. Just a gesture, as if to say, "We haven't buried you yet." But within days, that disappeared too. I started coming down to a cold kitchen. Dishes already rinsed, table wiped clean. I wasn't late. I was excluded. I'd make myself tea, alone, while I heard forks clicking upstairs, laughter behind closed doors, the faint sound of streaming shows I was never invited to watch. This was my house. I built every inch of it, paid off the land, designed the damn staircase. And now I was treated like some elderly tenant overstaying his lease. His wife, she used to smile at me, used to thank me for the life they lived. But after that meeting, something in her eyes changed. She stopped addressing me by name, stopped asking if I needed anything, walked past me in the hallway like I was furniture. One evening, I heard her talking on the phone. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was just walking past the office. She said, "He's still here, I know. I thought he'd move out by now, too." I stood there for a second, breathing in that sentence. Still here. Like I was the problem, the interruption, the one who wouldn't take the hint. I didn't say anything. I just walked away. Because by then, I had learned what words from them were worth. I started keeping to myself more, waking up before everyone, going to bed later. I'd sit on the porch with a blanket and a thermos of coffee, staring out at the backyard I landscaped with my own hands. I remember planting that maple tree when my son was 5. He helped dig the hole. I told him, "This tree will be here long after I'm gone." Now, I watched it grow alone, knowing he didn't even remember planting it. That's how it is, isn't it? You raise someone to stand taller than you, but never think they'll stand on you to do it. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the pretending, the little fake gestures they threw at me so they wouldn't look cruel to outsiders. An occasional, "Good morning." A polite knock on the door. Once, they asked if I wanted to join them for dinner. I said yes. I sat down. They talked over me the entire time. Inside jokes, business plans, a future I clearly wasn't part of. I could have disappeared mid-meal, and no one would have noticed. That was the last time I ate with them. I started eating in the garage. I had an old recliner out there, next to my toolbox. I'd microwave leftovers and sit there in silence, chewing through the shame. At least in that space, no one looked at me like I was wasting air. That garage had been the first office for the company. I kept the old blueprints up on the wall as a reminder. Now it was my refuge, my grave before the grave. There was a moment, I think it was the 3rd week after that meeting, where I stood at the doorway to the kitchen and watched them for a second. My son, his wife, their little social circle, laughing, pouring wine, living a life that I'd built down to the foundation. And I realized they weren't waiting for me to leave. They had already removed me, emotionally, mentally. In their minds, I was just a living debt they hadn't paid off yet. I didn't rage. I didn't shout. What would be the point? Rage requires hope, hope that someone still cares. But they didn't. And I accepted that, slowly, bitterly, but fully. And that's when something settled into me, a silence deeper than the one they gave me, a kind of clarity that didn't ask for revenge, only closure. I knew then, it wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about getting them to respect me again. That ship had sunk. But there was still one thing they'd forgotten, one detail no one ever asked about: the trust. They thought they had everything. They didn't know what I still controlled, what I still had access to, what I had quietly protected, not for power, not for leverage, but because I believed one day they'd need it. One day, they'd prove they were ready. But now I saw them clearly, and I knew they weren't ready, and they never would be. So I sat with that silence. I watered my plants. I fed the neighborhood cats that wandered through the yard. I answered no questions, started checking my accounts, reading old legal documents, quiet, calm, focused. Because while they laughed in the next room, I was preparing to disappear from theirs, for good. What they didn't know, what he never bothered to ask, was that the family trust had never been transferred into his name. Not officially, not legally, not even partially. He assumed, like so many entitled sons do, that because the house had his furniture and the company had his name on the press releases, he was the one in charge. But assumptions are dangerous in business, deadly when they involve legacy. What he forgot was this: ownership isn't about attention. It's about signatures. It's about what happens when the money gets quiet and the paperwork starts speaking. And in every document that mattered, my name was still the only one that counted. The $2.3 million was never in some flashy checking account. It wasn't the kind of money that sits in one place. I had split it years ago into a well-structured, low-visibility trust, one that was designed to protect the business from external collapse or internal stupidity. The kind of stupidity my son had started showing. The kind that puts ego over legacy, speed over structure, shortcuts over sustainability. I'd kept the trust quiet, even from him. I told him it was a rainy day fund. He assumed I meant $200,000. He had no idea what it really was. When he started making moves that could risk the company's foundation, dissolving vendor contracts, renegotiating long-standing deals with zero sensitivity, shifting culture with flashy hires who had no loyalty, I didn't say a word, but I started reading every clause about the clauses. I still had full discretionary authority. I had the power to terminate, to reassign, to dissolve. And most importantly, I had the right to act without notice, without cause, and without permission. He never asked about the control. That was his biggest mistake. He thought legacy was something he had already claimed. He didn't realize legacy is something you earn, not inherit, and he sure as hell hadn't earned it. You don't earn a legacy by humiliating the man who gave you everything. You don't earn a legacy by laughing behind doors while your father eats alone. You don't get to call yourself a king while the man who built the castle is still in the room. So I started planning. Slowly, quietly. I met with my lawyer, same man I've worked with for decades, trusted, loyal, old school, the kind of man who doesn't flinch when you say, "I'm ready to take it all back." He pulled up the documents. Nothing needed to be rewritten. Nothing even needed to be updated. I had written the original terms so tightly, so specifically, that every move I wanted to make now was already waiting, like a trap door beneath their feet. I didn't need his permission. I didn't even need to notify him. And that's what made it so perfect. Because while he walked around calling himself the CEO, I was sitting with the only title that mattered, the controller of the fund that kept the whole machine alive. I wasn't just the father. I was the quiet architect, the one who could pull the plug without ever raising his voice. The money wasn't just for payroll or family emergencies. It was woven into the bones of the company. When the trust pulled out, cash flow would collapse within 60 days unless a new investor came in. But there would be no new investor, because I had also been the guarantor of our largest vendor's line of credit, and when I stepped away, that guarantee would vanish. He didn't even know that. Never asked, never cared. And the beauty of it? It was all legal, ironclad, bulletproof. I wasn't stealing. I wasn't sabotaging. I was simply protecting what I built from the very man who thought he already owned it. Every day, I watched them laugh in the living room. Every day, I listened to them plan vacations, talk about renovations, brag about how the company was going to go public someday. I let them talk. I let them gloat. Because they didn't realize that while they were living off the system I designed, I had already started dismantling it from the inside, wire by wire. I sold a small asset first, just a test. A quiet offshore holding we kept in reserve. Moved it under a different name. No alerts, no emails. Then I cashed out the first portion of the liquid fund. Transferred it to a secure holding structure with multi-signature protection, something they'd never be able to access without me. And then I waited. The balance was now $2.1 million and dropping, but only because I was building something else behind the scenes. Not a shell, not a scam, a safeguard. I was preparing a future that didn't include them. And still, not a word from him. Not a question. Not even curiosity. That was the arrogance of it all. He assumed silence meant submission. He thought my quiet meant I was retreating, that I had finally gotten the message. He didn't understand. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. The legal team began preparing the termination of the trust. Not a hostile closure, a clean one, strategic, final. I would leave no loose ends, no obligations, no liabilities. It would all fold neatly back into my control, and by the time they noticed, it would already be done. I didn't hate him. That's what might surprise you. I didn't act out of rage. I acted because sometimes love has to step aside for dignity. Because if you give everything to someone who spits in your face, that's not love. That's self-erasure, and I had done that long enough. It happened on a Tuesday. No symbolism, no poetic timing. Just another quiet afternoon in a house that no longer saw me. I had just finished trimming the hedge out front, something I used to pay a landscaper for, but now did myself to pass the time. My back ached, my knees cracked with every step, but my hands still worked, my mind still worked, and that was all I needed. I walked into the garage, poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee, and sat in the same worn-out recliner I used to nap in when the company was young and I didn't have time for real rest. The same chair where I once rocked my son to sleep after late-night shifts. The same chair where I watched him take his first steps, right there on that concrete floor, clutching a wrench like it was a toy. That boy was gone now, replaced by a man who mocked the same foundation he was raised on. A man who looked me in the eye and called me a curse. So I pulled out my phone, the old one, not the one with email alerts and investor threads and a calendar full of meetings I wasn't invited to anymore. The old flip phone, the one I kept just for numbers that mattered. I dialed one, the lawyer. He picked up on the second ring. "Are we ready?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Everything's in place." That's all I needed to hear. I gave the green light, and just like that, decades of structure began to shift, not with explosions, not with announcements, but with quiet signatures and irreversible withdrawals. We started with the primary trust account, $2.3 million. Liquid, unencumbered, sitting there like a loaded weapon no one else knew existed. Within 48 hours, the transfer was done. Offshore, decentralized, locked behind layers of legal redirection that no one could peel back without authorization, and I was the only one who held it. The company's backbone? Pulled. The safety net they didn't know they were standing on? Gone. But not in a way that triggered alarms. I didn't crash anything. I didn't burn it down. I simply removed the protection. Removed the part they had never earned, but always assumed would be there. And I did it without a single confrontation. No speeches, no outbursts. Just silence. My lawyer handled the final filings. The trust was officially dissolved. The last document slid into an envelope, postmarked, and dropped into the mail. Not to them, but to my own new legal address. I wanted everything clean. Nothing left behind. No thread they could tug. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a fight. I was going to leave them with confusion, the kind that doesn't scream, but strangles slowly. While they laughed upstairs that evening, I packed a single bag. Not a suitcase. A bag. One pair of jeans. 2 shirts. The worn brown jacket I used to wear to his soccer games. The one he used to say made me look like a real dad. I took my passport, my reading glasses, the photo of his mother I kept tucked behind my will, and the last key to a bank account that only I could access. I didn't touch their things, didn't leave a mess. I simply folded the page on this chapter of my life and closed the book behind me. I walked out the back door, not because I was sneaking out, but because the front door had stopped being mine the day he told me I ruined everything I touched. I drove to the airport in silence. No radio. No goodbye. No one noticed I was gone. No one called to ask where I was going. That, in itself, told me everything I needed to know. I boarded a one-way flight to a place no one in the family had ever visited. A small, quiet village where no one cared about names, networks, or generational businesses. A place where I could sit with my hands in the dirt and grow something new. Something simple. Something that didn't depend on the approval of the ungrateful. Before I left the country, I made one final move. I mailed a letter, not an explanation, not a threat, just a statement. One sentence, sealed in an unmarked envelope, dropped into their mailbox like a ghost passing through. And then I was gone. By the time they would realize the money was missing, the trust closed, and the power gone, I'd be sipping tea in a garden that didn't require legacy to matter. And they'd be left with the silence they gave me. Only now it would echo. They wouldn't find me. They wouldn't reach me. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Because the only thing they ever really wanted from me was already gone. I don't remember the last thing I said to him before I left. I've thought about it a few times, replayed every hallway conversation, every half-hearted nod at dinner, every word he didn't listen to, trying to find if there was a moment where I said goodbye without knowing it. But I don't think there was. I don't think I gave him that luxury. Because when someone tells you, you ruin everything you touch, they don't deserve a farewell. They deserve silence. They deserve to wake up to absence, not death, not drama, just the space where something used to be. Leaving wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. That's the difference between people like me and people like him. I don't burn things on my way out. I don't make announcements. I don't ask to be seen. I just go. I disappear with the same patience I used to build everything. Quiet hands, quiet steps, quiet mind. I had the ticket already printed. I didn't fly private. I didn't check bags. Just a carry-on and a coat. No one at the airport looked twice. I was just another older man in a line of strangers. That anonymity, it used to terrify me. Now, it calmed me. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't someone's father. I wasn't someone's boss. I wasn't someone's burden. I was just a man with a boarding pass and no one waiting on the other side. The flight was long. I didn't sleep. I didn't read. I just stared out the window into the dark, somewhere over the ocean, and let my bones finally go still. I kept thinking about how quiet it was. No emails buzzing. No investor group chats. No tension in my chest from wondering if I was disappointing the very people I built a future for. Just stillness. When I landed, it was raining. The kind of soft rain that doesn't ask for attention. I stepped outside the terminal and breathed air that didn't smell like ambition. Just earth. Just sky. I rented a car. No GPS, just a map folded on the seat beside me. I drove for hours through hills, past rivers, through villages where no one cared about last names or market caps or who sat at what end of a conference table. Just people, living, breathing, feeding chickens, repairing roofs, selling bread from roadside stalls. I passed them all and never once felt the need to say who I used to be. I arrived at a small house near the edge of a coastal town. I had arranged it in advance, through a friend of someone I helped once, decades ago. It wasn't luxurious. A tin roof, cracked tiles, a garden overrun with weeds. But it was mine. Not inherited, not stolen, not named after me. Just mine. The landlord handed me the keys and didn't ask what I was running from. That silence was worth more than gold. Inside, I unpacked my bag slowly. I put the photo of his mother on the windowsill. She would have hated what he became. Not just the cruelty, but the emptiness. The hollow man who smiles for cameras, but forgets birthdays. I whispered her name once, just to hear it. Then I lit a candle, not for grief, but for gratitude. Because if she were still here, maybe none of this would have happened. Or maybe it would have hurt more. I started building a new life the next morning. Nothing grand, just routine. Tea at sunrise, walks by the ocean, cleaning the garden, fixing the sink, feeding the stray cat that started showing up around noon. I didn't check the news. I didn't log into any accounts. I didn't care if they had noticed I was gone yet. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about making them feel my absence. It was about no longer feeling theirs. I mailed one letter before I left the country. No return address, no explanation, just a plain white envelope with a single typed line inside. If I ruin everything I touch, then let me leave you with nothing to break. No name, no signature, just the truth, delivered like a verdict, quiet, undeniable. I know when he finds that letter, he'll try to spin it. He'll call it petty. He'll say I abandoned them, that I sabotaged his future, that I acted out of bitterness. But he'll never say the one thing that's true, that I left him exactly what he gave me, nothing. I don't regret disappearing. Not for a second. I regret staying as long as I did. I regret believing silence would soften him. I regret thinking love was enough to fix entitlement. It wasn't. And by the end, I wasn't a father anymore. I was a wallet, a signature, a man waiting to be erased. Now, I don't wait for anything. I plant tomatoes. I watch birds. I sit on the steps in the evening with my hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea, and I let the sky darken without worrying about who needs me. No one does. And that's not a tragedy. That's freedom. Sometimes people walk past and nod politely. They don't know my story. They don't know the money, the company, the humiliation. They just see a man who tends to his yard and keeps to himself. And that, to me, is the greatest revenge. To be unknown after being used. To be silent after being mocked. To be gone, not because I ran, but because I chose peace over legacy. They found out 3 days after I left. That's when the silence turned loud for them. That's when the house that once felt too full started feeling too empty. Not because I left a mess behind, but because I left behind nothing at all. No words, no warning, no balance. I imagine it started simple. A bank transfer failed. A check bounced. Something small, like the cleaning service not getting paid, or the company card declining during a dinner he couldn't afford without my invisible hands behind the account. At first, he would have shrugged it off. Must be a glitch. That's how arrogance works. It always blames the system before it blames itself. But then the second call came. The accountant, or maybe the internal CFO. Someone asking why the monthly operational buffer hadn't been topped up from the trust, why certain payroll numbers looked thin, and suddenly the conversation turned. He'd start realizing something was wrong, something he couldn't see, something he had never bothered to understand, because he thought the money just existed. He thought legacies were bottomless. When he called the bank, they would have routed him to legal. When he called legal, they would have told him the trust was dissolved, fully, cleanly, irrevocably. I can almost hear him stammering, "There must be some mistake. That trust is mine." And I can hear the lawyer, calm as ever, replying, "It never was. Your father retained full authority. He exercised it. There's nothing left in your name." That's when the silence I left behind became a storm in their house. He would have rushed to call me, but my number was gone, my SIM deactivated, my last email server shut down. The backup numbers, all changed. The estate, sold. Nothing traceable, no trail. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the same one I once built by hand, with a letter opener in one fist and a printout in the other, watching the reality hit like waves he couldn't swim through. I know him. I know how quickly his confidence can collapse when he loses control. It would have started with denial. He can't do this. Then it turns to blame. She convinced him. The lawyer manipulated him. He must have lost his mind. Anything but the truth. He gave me silence, and I gave it back in full. His wife, she would have been the first to panic. Her world was built on the assumption that she married into wealth, that everything was covered, that she could plan renovations, vacations, clothing budgets, IVF treatments, all on money she never earned, from a man she laughed at behind closed doors. She would have started asking questions, angry ones. Where is the backup? What about the estate account? What about the investment fund? And all he could do was realize it was never his to begin with. I imagine the arguments, loud, bitter, furniture shaken, voices raised. A marriage built on borrowed legacy doesn't survive when the credit line disappears. Then came the outside damage. He would have walked into the next board meeting expecting nothing. But the vendor contracts I personally underwrote, they'd start to fall apart. The bridge loan tied to my personal guarantee, gone. The investors who trusted me more than him, quietly pulling out. He'd start seeing cracks in every wall, but he'd have no plaster to fill them, because the $2.3 million that once held the company's ribs together was now vapor, and I had made sure there was no ladder left for him to climb out. I don't picture this with joy. I'm not sitting here smiling like some bitter old man who finally got revenge. I picture it with distance, like watching a fire in a house I no longer live in. The windows melt, the roof collapses, but I'm already walking down another road, not turning back. That's the thing about revenge. It loses its appeal when peace takes its place. What I feel isn't satisfaction. It's relief. Relief that the imbalance has been corrected. That the debt, not financial, but emotional, has been paid. I spent decades protecting him from consequences. That was my greatest mistake. Because some lessons can't be taught. They have to be felt. He never feared the fall because he thought I'd always be there with a net, so I folded it, took it with me. Now, if he falls, he'll finally learn gravity isn't optional. I'm sure the letters came next. Maybe a lawyer tried to reach out. Maybe his wife sent something handwritten, a plea, maybe a threat, maybe an apology crafted by someone who only knows how to say sorry when the walls start cracking. I didn't read them. I left a forwarding address with no mailbox. Whatever came, it went nowhere. They'll recover, or they won't. That's no longer my concern. I didn't leave them ruined. I left them empty, the same way they left me. And now, the silence that once felt like exile feels like home. There was only one thing I left behind. One envelope, one message. I didn't handwrite it. That would have made it feel sentimental, emotional, like I was looking for closure. I wasn't. I had no interest in being remembered kindly. I had no interest in being remembered at all. My goal wasn't to spark regret. It was to end the conversation, not just the argument, the entire relationship. The envelope arrived the same day the fund balance hit zero. I had timed it that way on purpose, not to provoke them, but to pair the silence with a single line of truth. Inside, there was no money, no family crest, no soft forgiveness hiding between paragraphs. Just a white sheet of paper. One line. Black ink. Bold font. If I am a disgrace, then I will leave you with nothing to be proud of. No name, no signature, no address. Just that. That letter was my final gift. Not to them, to myself. Because when someone calls you a disgrace, when they publicly strip you of dignity, when they laugh in rooms you built, and eat meals in houses you paid for while pretending you no longer matter, you don't owe them an explanation. You owe them your absence. But absence only becomes powerful when it's tied to truth. And that letter was my truth. I don't know who opened it. Maybe it was him. Maybe his wife. Maybe they stood there together, expecting a will or a transfer slip or some final plea for understanding. Instead, they got silence with a spine. And I hope that silence filled the room until it became unbearable. I imagine him holding that paper, reading the line, reading it again, hoping there was more. Some follow-up sentence, some softened ending. But there was nothing else, because there was nothing left to say. Words mean nothing when they've already shattered under boots. You can't apologize to a man you buried. You can't hug a ghost. Maybe he tore it up. Maybe he kept it. Maybe he sat down and stared at it all night. I don't care. That letter wasn't for him. It was for the moment. The moment where the power he thought he'd seized slipped between his fingers, and he realized, too late, that I had never lost control. I had just chosen silence until I was ready to speak one final time. They may try to twist it now. They may tell others I was cruel, or unwell, or vindictive, but none of that matters, because no one will ask why the letter came. They'll only ask why it mattered so much. And the truth is, it only matters when it comes from someone who meant everything, before you decided they were nothing. That letter was not revenge. It was reality. I didn't threaten. I didn't accuse. I just answered. He said I ruined everything I touched. Fine. Then I touched the one thing he thought I wouldn't, the future. That one sentence took me 5 seconds to write, and it rewrote everything he thought he knew about me. He'll read it in quiet moments, in the back seat of cars, during early mornings when the house is still, when his wife is asleep, and he can't stop wondering how it all slipped through his hands. He'll carry the weight of those words longer than he ever carried the weight of my love. Because love was silent. But the absence, it echoes. I left no trace behind, no open threads, no money under the table. I burned no bridges. I just never built one back to them. And now there's nothing left for them to cross. That letter closed the book. Not the chapter, the book. Entirely. I won't write again. I won't appear at the holidays, won't send birthday cards, won't hover around the edges of their lives waiting for reconciliation. I don't want it. Not after what they gave me. Not after the laughter behind closed doors. Not after the humiliation in the boardroom. Not after the dinners I wasn't invited to in the house I paid off in full. I don't wish them harm, but I wish them emptiness, the same kind they gave me. And the letter was my way of handing it back, sealed and delivered. If they ever show it to others, if they try to paint me as heartless, I hope whoever reads it sees the clarity. Because in a world where people beg for closure, I gave it without hesitation. I gave them an ending. And now, there's nothing more to write. I don't check the time anymore. There's no point. No meetings to rush to. No boardrooms waiting on my nod. No birthday parties where I sit like furniture. The days move slowly here, and I let them. I rise with the sun and sleep when the moon says so. I eat when I'm hungry, not when someone else decides it's mealtime. And I speak only when I feel the words are worth using. Most days, they aren't. I've found comfort in the smallest things. A clay cup that keeps my tea warm. A patch of earth that finally yields tomatoes after 3 weeks of coaxing. A little dog that wanders in from a neighbor's yard and refuses to leave unless I hand him a slice of bread. He doesn't care who I was. He only cares that I feed him, sit beside him, and say nothing. He's the most honest relationship I've had in years. There are people in the village, of course. Farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, good people. They nod when I pass. Sometimes they ask questions. You live alone? I nod. No family? I nod again. No one pushes. They don't need details. My silence tells them everything they need to know. They don't need to know I once signed million-dollar deals, or that my name was once printed on leather conference room chairs. That version of me is gone. Not dead. Just no longer required. I spend mornings tending to the garden. My knees ache when I kneel, but I do it anyway. There's something honest about planting a seed and knowing exactly what it will become. Unlike people. People pretend. People change. But a seed will always grow into what it's meant to be. A tomato won't wake up one day and call you a disgrace. Afternoons are for walking. Along the cliffs, through quiet trails, past little stone cottages with shutters that creak in the wind. Sometimes I'll sit on a bench and just breathe. No phone buzzing, no staff asking for approvals, no son waiting for me to sign something so he can erase me behind my back. Just the ocean, the clouds, and the old man I've become. There are moments, brief, flickering, where I wonder what they're doing. Him, his wife, the shell of a company they tried to drag forward without the engine. Maybe they've moved on, found another investor, or maybe they're still trying to explain what happened to the trust, trying to convince people that I was unstable, that I sabotaged the family. Maybe. But I don't dwell on it. That story isn't mine anymore. They wrote me out. I just honored their edit. I've built something else here, not with bricks, not with contracts, but with peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't demand performance, the kind that doesn't ask for gratitude. No more waiting for phone calls that never come. No more pretending not to hear laughter behind doors. No more sitting at tables where my presence is tolerated but never welcomed. I make my own meals, wash my own clothes, sweep my own porch. Some would call it a small life, but it's bigger than anything I lived before, because for the first time, I belong only to myself. Sometimes I write, not letters, just thoughts, lines I wish I had said when I still cared about being heard. Most of them end up in the fire, because the more peace I find, the fewer words I need. That's the beauty of true solitude. It teaches you that not every pain needs to be spoken, not every betrayal needs a reply. And as for love, I gave it all away, every last drop. I poured it into a son who never once turned around to say, "Thank you," who never once asked, "How did we get here?" Who never once looked at the foundation beneath him and said, "This was built by someone who bled for me." I gave him everything, and in the end, all he saw was someone to replace. But here's what I've learned. Love without respect is just servitude, and legacy without gratitude is just a leash around your neck. I broke that leash the day I left. Now, I am free. I don't care what they say about me back home. I don't care what version of me they tell their friends or future children. Let them call me bitter. Let them call me cold. Let them call me gone. That's what I am, gone. But I didn't vanish out of weakness. I vanished out of clarity. Because when a man realizes he's being kept around only for what he can give, he has two choices: stay and rot quietly, or walk away and leave them with what they truly deserve: the silence. And that's what I gave them. A silence so wide, it filled the halls of a house I built. A silence so deep, they can't buy their way out of it. A silence so final, even my name became a question mark in their mouths. I built their world, then I walked out of it. And they will never build another one without remembering whose hands carved the first. They thought I'd die clinging to the legacy. They were wrong, because it turns out the real disgrace was raising a son who forgot who gave him everything.